As a 28-year-old woman, I found myself navigating a deeply uncomfortable situation involving my 26-year-old sister Sarah and my 29-year-old boyfriend. With Sarah's wedding just around the corner, her behavior around my boyfriend began to raise red flags. At first it was subtle, little comments and actions that seemed harmless on the surface, but left me feeling unsettled. It started with overly enthusiastic responses to my boyfriend's jokes. Even when they weren't particularly funny, Sarah laughed like they were the highlight of her day. At first I chalked it up to wedding excitement, convincing myself she was just in high spirits, but soon, her behavior escalated. She began finding excuses to touch him, placing a hand on his arm during conversations, lightly brushing past him, or standing just a bit too close. These actions were small, but they carried an air of intention that made me uneasy. Her gaze lingered on him when she thought no one was looking, and I couldn't ignore the knot in my stomach every time I caught her. One evening, after a particularly awkward family dinner where Sarah had been excessively flirtatious, I decided to bring it up with my boyfriend. I asked him directly if he'd noticed her behavior. He seemed genuinely confused, replying, "What do you mean?" I detailed the laughing, the touching, and the way she always seemed to be near him. He listened attentively but ultimately dismissed my concerns, saying, "I think you're overthinking it. She's probably just excited about the wedding. It's harmless." Despite his reassurances, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. I decided to observe more closely, hoping to prove myself wrong. However, over the following weeks, Sarah's behavior only grew more obvious. Every time we were together as a family, she would make a point of sitting near him, finding reasons to ask for his help with wedding tasks, even when I was right there. It felt like she was deliberately creating opportunities to be close to him. The breaking point came during a family barbecue at my parents' house. At one point, I went inside to use the bathroom, and when I returned, I saw something that made my heart sink. Sarah and my boyfriend were standing in the corner of the yard, speaking quietly, their bodies far closer than necessary. She giggled in a way that made my stomach churn. When they noticed me, they immediately stepped apart, and Sarah walked away as if nothing had happened. I felt a mix of nausea, anger, and betrayal, but chose not to confront them right then and there to avoid causing a scene. Later that night, when we were alone, I brought it up with my boyfriend. Trying to stay calm, I asked him what he and Sarah had been discussing earlier. He seemed taken aback by the question and explained that they'd been talking about wedding details, like the music selection. His response felt hollow, and I couldn't help but wonder why such a simple conversation required them to stand so close. When I pressed him further, he sighed, visibly frustrated, and insisted there was nothing inappropriate going on. "She's just being friendly," he said, brushing off my concerns yet again. But by this point, I couldn't hold back any longer. I told him how frustrated I was that Sarah was blatantly flirting with him, and that he wasn't setting any boundaries to stop it. My boyfriend looked hurt by my words and asked what I expected him to do. He pointed out that Sarah was my sister, and that being confrontational would create unnecessary tension. To him, politely telling her to back off wasn't an option. I reminded him that boundaries didn't have to be rude, but they were necessary. He reassured me again that he wasn't interested in Sarah at all, but his reluctance to address her behavior left me feeling both unsupported and uneasy. The tension between us lingered, and I began to wonder how much longer I could tolerate the situation without taking action myself. Claiming there was nothing to clarify, my boyfriend insisted I was seeing problems where none existed. Our conversation went in circles, neither of us willing to concede. The frustration mounted, leaving us both feeling angry and disconnected. After arguing for what felt like hours, it became clear that we weren't going to resolve anything that night. He continued to insist I was imagining things, while I felt he was refusing to acknowledge the obvious. We eventually went to bed in silence, the tension between us palpable. The next day I realized that avoiding the issue was only making things worse. If I wanted clarity, I needed to address the situation directly with my sister. Gathering my courage, I called her and asked if we could meet for coffee. She readily agreed, her voice cheerful and oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. We arranged to meet at a cozy cafe near her apartment. When I arrived, my nerves were on edge. My hands trembled slightly as I stirred my coffee while Sarah sat across from me, radiating excitement as she chattered about her wedding plans. Her obliviousness only heightened my discomfort, making it harder to speak. After a few minutes, I couldn't hold it in any longer. I interrupted her mid-sentence, my tone betraying the seriousness of what I was about to say. "We need to talk," I began, trying to steady my voice. The sudden shift in tone caught her off guard, and she looked at me with wide-eyed surprise. "What's wrong?" she asked. Taking a deep breath, I explained. I told her I'd noticed how she'd been behaving around Tom, my boyfriend, and that it was making me uncomfortable. I pointed out the flirting, the casual touches, and the lingering looks. I made it clear that her behavior needed to stop. As I spoke, I watched her expression shift from surprise to confusion, and finally to anger. She vehemently denied everything, demanding to know what I was talking about. "I haven't been flirting with Tom," she snapped, her voice sharp. I refused to back down, explaining that whether or not she realized it, her actions were crossing a line. "It's not just in my head," I said firmly. "Your behavior has been inappropriate and it's causing me a lot of distress." Her response was dismissive, almost mocking. She let out a short, humorless laugh and said I was being ridiculous. "Tom is practically family," she argued. "I'm just being friendly." But her words only added to the tension. It was clear she was trying to brush off my concerns, but I wasn't about to let it go. I pressed further, expressing my frustrations. I pointed out how she always found excuses to be near Tom, to touch him, and to laugh at his jokes, whether or not they were funny. "It's not just friendliness," I said, my voice firm. "It's more than that, and it's making me uncomfortable." As I spoke, her face turned a deep shade of red, her anger and disbelief growing. She seemed stunned by my accusations, especially so close to her wedding. Her retort was cutting. "Maybe you're just insecure," she said coldly. "You must not trust him or yourself to accuse me of something like this." Her words stung, but I stood my ground. "This isn't about insecurity," I replied. "It's about respect. You're crossing a line and it needs to stop." Abruptly, she stood up, the screech of her chair against the floor breaking the tense silence. Her face was a mix of anger and indignation. "I'm not going to sit here and listen to paranoid, ridiculous accusations," she declared, her voice shaking with fury. "If you can't trust your own sister, that's your problem, not mine." With that, she stormed out of the cafe, leaving me sitting there alone, a whirlwind of emotions coursing through me. Guilt and doubt crept in as I replayed the conversation in my mind. Had I overreacted? Was I really just being paranoid? The questions swirled, but deep down, I knew I had spoken my truth. When I got home, my boyfriend immediately noticed something was wrong. Concern etched on his face, he asked me what had happened. I recounted my conversation with Sarah, sharing every detail of what I had said and how she had reacted. As I spoke, his expression grew more serious. When I finished, he let out a heavy sigh and told me he thought I had made a mistake. He was worried that confronting her, especially so close to her wedding, might have deeply hurt her. Feeling defensive, I asked him if he was taking her side. He quickly assured me that he wasn't, but he expressed doubt that Sarah had been flirting with him in the first place. Even if she had been, which he insisted seemed unlikely, he thought confronting her so directly might not have been the best way to handle things. His words only added to my confusion, leaving me unsure whether I had done the right thing. Tears welled up in my eyes as I asked, "So what was I supposed to do, just ignore it?" My voice trembled with frustration and hurt. Sensing my distress, my boyfriend walked over and wrapped his arms around me, trying to comfort me. He gently suggested that perhaps there might have been a better way. Maybe I could have spoken with him more, or approached Sarah in a way that wasn't so confrontational. He voiced concern that Sarah might now be upset with both of us, and worried this could create an uncomfortable shadow over her wedding. Feeling overwhelmed, I pulled away from his embrace. "So this is all my fault?" I asked, needing to understand if he truly believed I was to blame. He sighed deeply, struggling to find the right words, and explained that he didn't mean to put all the blame on me. However, he did think I might have let my emotions get the better of me and overreacted. We argued back and forth, but it became clear we weren't going to reach an agreement. There was a chasm between our perspectives, and neither of us seemed willing to fully understand the other. Eventually, he gave up and went to bed, leaving me alone with my swirling thoughts and growing doubts. In the days that followed, the tension only grew. Sarah had stopped speaking to me entirely, creating an agonizing distance between us. My parents, noticing Sarah's distress, called to ask why she was so upset. I tried to explain the situation, but it was obvious from their tone that they believed I had overreacted. Their subtle but clear judgment added to the weight on my shoulders. As the wedding day approached, my anxiety deepened. I was supposed to be a bridesmaid, a role that now felt more like a punishment than an honor. I wasn't even sure if Sarah still wanted me to be part of her big day. My boyfriend, however, was still invited and suggested that we both attend to show there were no hard feelings. But the idea of standing there watching her walk down the aisle while knowing how angry she was made me feel physically sick. I tried repeatedly to reach out to Sarah, but she ignored all my efforts. I left voicemails apologizing and saying we needed to talk. I even went to her apartment, but she refused to open the door. The silence between us was suffocating, and the closer the wedding drew, the more my anxiety grew. I even had a vivid dream in which I showed up at the wedding and everyone turned to stare at me, pointing and whispering. I woke up cold and shaking. The situation reached a breaking point when Sarah told our mother about my accusations. Furious, my mom called me, shouting about how selfish I was being and how I could make such accusations right before Sarah's wedding. "How could you accuse your own sister of something like that?" she yelled. She refused to listen as I tried to explain my perspective. Her anger was palpable as she demanded I fix the situation immediately and apologize to Sarah. With the wedding day looming, I felt utterly trapped, unsure how to move forward and terrified that I had irreparably damaged my relationships with my family. The stress in my family was unbearable. Sarah still refused to speak to me, and my parents were offended on her behalf. Tom, my partner, continued to insist that I was overreacting, which only deepened my feelings of sadness and frustration. Determined to find some clarity, I decided to visit my parents' house 1 week before the wedding in hopes of sorting things out. As I approached the front door, I heard muffled voices coming from the side of the house. Curious, I followed the sound to the garden, and what I saw there stopped me in my tracks. Partially concealed by a large plant, Sarah and Tom were locked in a passionate embrace. They kissed deeply, her legs wrapped around his waist while his hand slid beneath her top. They were so engrossed in each other that they didn't even notice me standing there. It felt like the air had been knocked out of my lungs. I was frozen in place, unable to move or speak as the reality of what I was witnessing hit me. A powerful wave of anger and betrayal surged through me, and before I could stop myself, I screamed, "What the hell is this?" My voice shook with the intensity of my emotions, and the reaction from both of them was immediate. They broke apart in shock, their guilty expressions telling me everything I needed to know. Sarah's face turned ghostly pale, while Tom stammered, "It's not what it looks like," but it was exactly what it looked like, confirming every fear and suspicion that had been eating away at me. Tears streamed down my face as I choked out, "How could you? My own sister and my boyfriend!" The pain in my voice was undeniable. Sarah began to cry, her voice trembling as she tried to apologize. "I'm so sorry," she sobbed, struggling to explain. "We didn't mean for this to happen," but I couldn't bear to hear their excuses. The betrayal was too deep, too raw. Without another word, I turned and ran to my car, their desperate pleas for me to stop falling on deaf ears. As I drove away, my mind spun in a whirlwind of disbelief and heartbreak. My phone began ringing incessantly. First Tom, then Sarah, and finally my mom. I couldn't bring myself to answer any of them. The pain was still too fresh. When I finally reached home, I felt numb. I immediately packed a bag with enough clothes and essentials to last a few days. I couldn't stay there, not after what had just happened. Before leaving, I sent Tom one final text. "We're done. Don't try to contact me again." Then I turned off my phone, severing any further communication, and drove off. Now I'm sitting in a hotel room in a nearby city trying to piece together what to do next. With the wedding only a few days away, I know I can't attend. My relationship with Tom is over and the bond I once shared with my sister may be beyond repair. It feels as though my entire world has crumbled. Everyone made me feel like I was imagining things, yet in the end I was right all along. The weight of that realization is almost too much to bear. I find myself questioning whether I'll ever be able to trust anyone again. After several days of silence and heartbreak, I knew there was one person who needed to know the truth. Mark, Sarah's fiancé. With a heavy heart, I decided to call him. When he answered, I could hear the confusion in his voice. He mentioned that Sarah had been inconsolable, claiming that I had vanished and wasn't responding to anyone. Taking a deep breath, I began explaining everything to Mark. I told him about the suspicions that had nagged at me, how both Tom and Sarah had dismissed my concerns, and finally, I described in detail the heartbreaking scene I had witnessed in my parents' garden. Mark listened quietly, his silence punctuated only by occasional murmurs to let me know he was still there, taking in every word. When I finally finished, the line was heavy with silence. Then, in a calm and measured voice, Mark thanked me for telling him. He added that he needed some time to process everything and ended the call. As I stared blankly at my phone, I couldn't help but wonder what Mark would do now that he knew the truth. As the wedding day drew near, I heard nothing from Mark or the rest of my family. Sarah had stopped trying to contact me altogether, and I began to suspect that she had somehow convinced Mark to forgive her. The thought of her escaping the consequences of her actions, walking down the aisle in a perfect wedding while my life lay in ruins, made me feel physically sick. I knew there was no way I could attend. Instead, I resolved to spend the day alone, focusing on rebuilding my life after such devastating betrayal. On the evening of the wedding, I received an unexpected call from my cousin Emma. Her voice was hushed but charged with urgency and excitement as she said, "Oh my God, you won't believe what just happened." Confused and intrigued, I asked her to explain. Without hesitation, Emma dove into her story. She described how everything had appeared normal at first. Sarah looked stunning in her wedding dress, and Mark stood at the altar ready to begin the ceremony. But when it came time for the vows, Mark stepped forward and announced that he had something to say. My heart raced as Emma recounted the scene. In front of all the guests, Mark declared that he couldn't go through with the wedding. He said he couldn't marry someone who had betrayed her own sister and shattered her life by becoming involved with her boyfriend. The room fell silent as his words landed like a bombshell. Emma continued, explaining how Sarah had turned ghostly pale as Mark's words sank in. To everyone's shock, Mark then turned to my parents, apologized, and explained that they deserved to know the real reason why I had distanced myself from the family. The guests began whispering among themselves, trying to make sense of the unfolding drama, while Sarah broke down into tears at the altar. Mark walked out of the church, leaving her sobbing and alone. "Emma, it was like something out of a movie," Emma said, her voice still tinged with disbelief. "Everyone's in shock. Your parents are trying to get the full story from Sarah, but she's an emotional wreck." I sat there, stunned, as Emma recounted everything. A swirl of emotions overtook me. Vindication that the truth had finally come out, but also deep sadness for the pain it had caused my family. Sensing my silence, Emma gently asked, "Are you okay?" "I'm not sure," I admitted truthfully. "I never wanted it to end like this." After a little more conversation with Emma, I hung up the phone and sat quietly trying to process everything. While the truth was now out in the open, it had come at an enormous cost. My relationship with Tom was over, my bond with Sarah was irreparably broken, and my family was in turmoil. The truth, though powerful, hadn't magically fixed everything. Healing and rebuilding trust would take time and effort. For the first time in weeks, however, I felt a glimmer of relief. The weight of silent truths and buried suspicions had been lifted. I could finally begin to move forward, free from the gaslighting and self-doubt that had plagued me. While the road ahead would not be easy, I resolved to take things one day at a time and focus on my own growth and healing. To those who supported me through this ordeal, thank you. Your words of encouragement mean more to me than you could ever know. And to anyone facing similar circumstances, trust your instincts. Don't let others make you doubt what you know in your heart to be true. Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more shocking real-life stories happening around you.